Well, Dan Gold, do you want to kick us off with the view from Broward, and then Marie, if you want to chime in after about Broward College?
So let me begin, as always, with gratitude for everyone being here on the call. This is the beginning of November. It's the beginning of standard time. For us here in Broward, it's also kind of the beginning of what I will call a plateau of normalcy, in so much as we can have it with our current pandemic conditions. Depending on what happens on the elections tomorrow, and by the time they're resolved, hopefully by January 20th, we anticipate getting guidance from the state of Florida in the coming weeks as to whether or not we will be allowed to continue having a mix of students at home and in the classrooms. About 20% of our students have returned to the classrooms. About 80% are still at home. Our teachers are simultaneously teaching them in our digital learning platform that involves, the same assignments for both groups, but different modalities of the learning environment. It's very difficult. Starting next Tuesday, we'll be discussing some of the challenges that we've been having with our traditional tools with our school board. We have a discussion on progress monitoring in addition to a discussion on equity. But in terms of progress monitoring, one of the things that has become abundantly clear is that testing conditions or assessment conditions matter. When we look at our performance on our traditional online assessment platforms, we are seeing wildly varying scores between classes within this year. But most importantly, the full distribution profile of this year's assessment is radically different than previous year's assessments. And we believe that's a combination of some kids being disengaged and not taking the assessments as attentively as they otherwise would, and students getting assistance from siblings and parents while they are undertaking online assessments at home. It's making it very, very difficult for us to get a good sense of where our students are at. In fact, if we just rely on our digitally mediated assessments, it not only appears we did not have a COVID slide, we did not have a summer slide, and our students in at least our elementary grades are outperforming students from other grades in the past. Our third graders this year are outperforming third graders last year. And while I'm very confident in the learning that we were able to make occur in the spring and thus far in the fall, I just don't believe it. And so this issue of how do we know how students are doing is one of the issues that's really rising to the table. And this plays directly into one of the conversations we're going to have today, which is around equity. How are we knowing that our interventions, which often rely on in-person small groups and differentiated attention to students by teachers, are being able to be effective when many of those students are remote? And that for teachers to do small group instruction, even if digitally mediated, is greatly challenged under our current learning conditions. The same accountability system is going to apply for the students and the school district as a whole. It's causing a lot of angst, particularly at our policymaking school board level. And it's a question that I think is going to continue to arise through the fall. I will pause and ask anyone if they have particular questions about Broward, because I know we do have a great conversation coming up with Marie, as well as some issues around some equity questions that Greg's kind of queued up for us.
You have an email right now from Marie about to pick a time that will work for you. Dan, to get together to go deeper with Broward College. Marie, is there something that you wanted to start with the framing?
Sure. Well, I think you know, we're seeing a lot of the same challenges that Dan just described. You know, so Broward College, a little different approach to, you know, what our future holds. We, of course, have a little bit more liberty in being able to only invite back to campus the faculty and staff that volunteer to come back to campus. So a lot of our face-to-face offerings in the spring are predicated on that notion. Otherwise, we've got a number of things in place, like streaming from the classroom to also remote students remaining remote, of course, our online offerings, and a variety of different modalities. When it comes to assessment, you know, we're not only very much challenged by the fact that we know that a lot of our students are at home in less than ideal learning conditions, and really trying to talk our faculty through, you know, how stringent are they about a student turning on their camera when they may be trying to take class from the bathroom because it's the only quiet place inside of their home. At the same time, recognizing that some students are maybe taking advantage of that situation and are signing on to class and happen to still be signed on an hour and a half after class is over, leading you to wonder if they actually were there at all. Couple that with, you know, an online assessment monitoring tool we use, HonorLock. It's a Band-Aid, right? It's not immutable. It is not without its flaws. So there's a lot of concern, as there should be, by our faculty about academic integrity at this time, and you know, ensuring that students are in fact the ones that are taking tests, that they are in fact learning what we say that they're learning, from a variety of different perspectives. So it is definitely interesting times. It will be definitely interesting to see what happens tomorrow, and we probably won't know what happens tomorrow. It may take another week or so. But I think a lot of that will continue to shape the responses by Broward County Public Schools and Broward College as to how it is that we're going to continue to address ensuring that our students are learning in a safe environment, you know, with our faculty, staff, and students' safety and health, of course, foremost in our minds.
So the other thing that I'll focus on, and this is something that's been a lot of commentary, and it's something that Marie and I are going to align on, but our comprehensive learner record discussion continues to resonate at the state level, and I continue to get feedback from folks that they want to hear and learn more. So I think many of the partners here will be able to think through with us if we can move the state of Florida to adopt a roadmap to be able to enable comprehensive learner records for the state as a whole. How do we go about setting that kind of state policy? And I see Marie slowly nodding her head. It's a big, weighty opportunity, but we need to take steps very carefully. It's something that touches on career and tech ed, it touches on exceptional students, it touches on graduation, touches on transcripts, but there's a lot of people who are now coming to realize that what we know about kids needs to both be with the students so that they have agency, and that word is coming up in a lot of different meetings that I'm able to participate in, including the state school board, but also what do we do to replace these large monolithic student information systems that people are realizing something's got to come next. And I think CLR is one of the things that's under consideration, as opposed to a state centralized data warehouse. That's a big challenge. because we've got standards, but how do we get people to adopt them without making them feel that they are buying something? It's about changing their business processes and models.
So we're going to get deeper into this for sure. John's going to be leading the majority of this meeting again as we focus really on case encoding of these algebra pathways. And I've got a little introductory article that I just shared in the chat, which I want to talk a little bit about as a segue. But before I do, I wanted to just see whether others wanted to provide any updates, whether Bill or, and Michael, whether there are any updates you guys wanted to provide, and or Alan and Mary Ellen, are there any other updates that people would like to provide at the beginning? Okay, and feel free to jump in later also, if you'd like to later on. I just put in the chat an article, and I think it starts to make the connection about why do we call this the Broward Equity Co-Lab? This particular article about reducing racial bias in grading looks at, a little smaller here so I can see, differential, the implicit bias impacting grading. So this is kind of traditional grading and then rubric-based grading. So in this article, it looks at these two writing examples, and the kid on the right was graded lower. Right, and so that's one part of what we're trying to get at, is trying to get at a fairer, more equitable approach to looking at work. One aspect of that is to make it easier to see where there's implicit bias and try to move past it.
So Greg, I want to build off this, and I just realized that I could pull on some work that we'll be sharing with our board next Tuesday about progress monitoring. I'm going to share my screen now, if you don't mind. You've raised the question here about implicit bias changing, impacting the way in which teachers perceive student abilities. And there's implicit bias both in the subjective form of how they respond to the written example, which you've given, but I also think we need to acknowledge that there is algorithmic bias in some of the levels of achievement, and that it's really hard sometimes to differentiate between what's a difference in an algorithmic bias versus what's a real difference in student performance. So I'm going to share this if I can. Let's see. Yes, we can. All right. So one of the things that the state of Florida required all school districts to do, and I'll try and put this into a presenter mode. Can everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
We do.
So
the two screens there.
All right. Yeah.
Maybe
this is a problem when it comes to the way this works.
You have two monitors up?
No, I don't. But let's just look at this. So the state of Florida requires all school districts to have a progress monitoring if we were to have what's called innovative learning, i.e. if we were going to be allowed to teach kids remotely, what were we going to do to monitor them? And based on previous breadth of implementation, the one that we went with was this instrument called iReady. But you'll see that the Black performance of 3 or more grade levels behind for grades 3 through 8 is at 28%. For white, it's at 13%. And that if you go to even 1 grade level behind, you're looking at 70% of students for the Black race definition or designation. and that's only 44% for white. We see consistent levels of measurement bias, whether it's by teachers or by instruments. In this case, it happens to be iReady, that are not always borne out when it comes to more race neutral instruments. Not even our FSA scores are as biased as we see in these instruments. And that's not to call out this product. This is consistent across other product spaces that we are doing. When we talk about eliminating disparities, we've got to make sure that we are eliminating the disparities as measured by the outcome and removing the biases in the way in which we come to understand how our students are performing. Now, this one happens to focus on English language arts, though we can also see it. This is all ELA. I don't think I've got anything here for math, which is something, yeah, this whole deck is focused on our ELA side, but you can see there's free and reduced lunch, there's significant biases. This is for grade 8 when these kids are entering high school. 45% are measuring at 3 or more grade levels behind. What's crazy is that the state average for performing at satisfactory above on these assessments means that if you're getting 60% of your kids at satisfactory or above, your school district is perceived of as doing well. That's not a problem that we're going to fix. We're not going to be able to change the state's definition of what satisfactory is. Principals are chasing letter grades. Teachers are chasing high proficiency rates, but when the proficiency rate is at 60%, it tells me that there's a problem with the instrument, not just with the scale of measurement. And I really want to dig deep into this question in the coming weeks and months of how do we get better instruments that actually are informative about what students know and can do. And I do believe that our CLR work is absolutely critical on it, as is our case alignment, which Jonathan's about to frame for us. So,
can I jump in with a question here about that specifically?
please.
So, I mean, a system like this, I have some familiarity with the technology behind iReady, as I worked there for several years in the early days. The assessments are being delivered. There's no knowledge of any of those student factors that you're reflecting in the reports until the reports are generated. So is the theory, I mean, maybe you're not presenting a theory, maybe it's just an I don't know yet, but is the theory that the way the assessment items are crafted themselves have the bias? Is that the source of it? Because it's, it's closed-ended, so it's not the grader with the bias, and the assessment tool didn't know any of these facts about the student early on. So where do you think the bias is in the system? I'm
raising the question that due to the output inequity that is visible, I'm raising the question of, are there hidden variables that we don't currently see? And
okay, so you're on a search for the hidden variables. You're not necessarily putting forward where.
I'm not. If I would, I'd be advocating for what to do to address it.
Sure. Okay.
Right? And these are really uncomfortable conversations for me to have with myself, much less other people. So I'm kind of just spilling the challenge out to us. When we talk about equity, output measures are what we typically talk about. We also know, unfortunately, that there are significant input variations. For example, children who are in low-performing schools tend to have teachers who have less years of experience. tend to have higher turnover at the administrative as well as at the teacher level. There's lots of research about describing all these problems. I want some small iterative changes that we can try here in Broward to break this, right? So our work with the Algebra project in saying that atomizing kids is one form of that. Our work with Saga about bringing tutoring to the table is another piece of it. I just know that if we're going to make sure that our kids can be fluent in language and logics, that they're able to actually have mastered by the time they leave us and go to Marie, that we need to have done things differently. And this is not a new challenge. Every school district is facing it. But I'm willing to try some profound things here in Broward to get in front of this.
Yeah,
Open it up. Okay.
I was just gonna say it's excellent and noble work. It's just getting to the root of it is so sticky and thorny, right? So yeah, I'd be fascinated if, similar to some accusations that the SATs had, a decade ago around the nature of the way the questions were worded or the subject areas that the questions tackled had implicit biases in them. If this is like a problem for the psychometricians to address, or where the root of that is. So it's
And
fascinating.
part of it does come to not only the phrasing, right? So there's a linguistic question, but there's also the prior knowledge questions. Are the analogies, metaphors, examples from that are on there? Is there a difference? And that's not to say one's better or worse than another. It's just, are there differences that are impacting when I show you those graphs with the profound gaps based on race? What are the variables that are playing into that?
So let's segue to exactly that, right? And, John and Guy, is Guy on as well? I know that Tara wasn't able to be on. Guy's on. So do you guys, John, you and Guy met earlier today, right? So do you have some answers? Do you have an approach that you want to share with others?
Yeah, let me share my screen first. And yeah, Guy and I had a terrific conversation. I'll be talking with Daryl later in the week about some of their playlist work, and I've got a email invite out to Vicki to talk about ESL that Rebecca gave me. So thanks to everybody who's been helping me navigate this. Consider this a sort of sharing of a kind of work in progress, because what I've been trying to do is, sharing, but just trying to get to the kind of.
Oh, John, there you go. You just fixed the problem that I had. Good job.
Yeah.
People
Yeah,
send
I pulled the plug on my external monitor.
Nope. Great job.
A quick hardware solution. So, at this stage, before sort of jumping into kind of case and code and all that, it's sort of thinking at a high level what we're doing. For folks who weren't in previous calls like Naomi, what we're trying to do here at Broward is we've got a very ambitious agenda for this comprehensive learner record, which is going to have to be informed by assertions. Those assertions have to be based on something, and really everything, including the discussion we had up till now, is kind of boiling down to what are these assertions going to be based on, right? The conversation about assessment is how are these measurements going to be accurate and unbiased, but one way you do that, certainly in like professional test development, which is the world I lived in for many years, is to start with understanding kind of what you're measuring, and then you could apply proper kind of techniques to measurement or teaching or anything. So in a way, we call this the sort of genome, because this is where everything would sort of build off of. And the approach, and this is after, conversations with certainly Guy today, but also kind of all the ones I've had so far over the last, well, just really been a week, we sort of have kicked this in, is that currently there's sort of 3 interconnected strands. So if you think of this as sort of DNA, except a sort of triple helix versus a double helix, what initially sort of identified is there are standards that need to be sort of built into this, and then there's content that also needs to be built into this. But then there's a set of human factors. I'm guessing we'll spend most of the time talking about the human factors, though I'm eager for feedback on any of these areas. On the standard side, we've got, the current Florida math standards, the maths, okay? And then there is the new Florida best standards. And and this is not a sort of discussion on one standard versus the other, standards change all the time. So, but we need some way of sort of connecting these to each other, which the work that I've done with Greg has been about mapping all state standards to what we call a mathematics compendium, the sort of lingua franca of math. And so this part of the project is pretty straightforward. It's actually largely, mostly done. We've done a lot of this work just ongoing as part of our crosswalking work. As an added benefit, this gives you access to the data from the 50 states. So this is kind of stuff that's already underway. But one of the things that we can do with this is to take things like the coherence maps, which, if those you haven't seen, these are available documents that we talked about this last Friday, where we map from one standard to another so that we know if someone's struggling with a high school algebra standard, the precursor to that might be a 7th grade or a 6th grade standard. So you could sort of track back, and through understanding how these standards connect, you can more effectively target learning. So that's one piece we're talking about. Is sort of adding. Yep, somebody had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the connection here that Travis and this is exactly what you were sharing, Travis, right? That this is the work that you guys have done, and it would be good to get you involved with, at minimum, providing feedback into what John's doing, but you may also be able to shortcut some of this work by providing some of your scaffolding on pre-algebra skills that are the precedent skills that John's talking about. And Peter, certainly you guys have done similar work at Carnegie. So yeah.
Yeah, this seems like an ideal place for our organization to really plug in.
And I'd love to talk to you, because this is something that, we plug it in this case to the compendium that informs obviously the Florida project, but all projects. And CASE is ideal for this, because CASE has the sort of precedes and preceded by associations, which can be built in and then sort of propagate out, and there's other things we could do in this, right? I had a colleague at my last job who's did a research project where she correlated advanced math topics at the college level, and how they relate to teaching math at lower grade, like K-12 grade levels, how an understanding of these. So anyway, this just sort of shows how content leads to content, but also in theory, kind of pedagogy leads to content. And that gets us into the next piece. So this is sort of work. This is the piece that's the sort of very valuable, but it's not like we don't know how to do this. So this is sort of pretty straightforward. We could do this right in CASE. CASE already supports it. Then you've got the sort of mapping of content. And here's where the conversations mostly I've had last week and today with Guy, and will continue, is, what constitutes the content, right? We've got content that's already in your Canvas courses that Marianne's, you'll kind of walk me through, and I've been sort of playing with them. And these, I think I've captured most of the key content assets, your Algebra Core and Algebra Nation, your Go Mathematics, HMH content, additional assets from CK12 and GeoGebra. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So there are pieces that are in Canvas. There's also other assets that are available to the district. We already saw kind of a iReady product, or there's Mastery Connect that's delivering Certica assessments that Guy informed me of. There's obviously Khan. And what can we do with these assets? Well, one thing we could potentially do is map them back to the standards, right? So as we kind of work through the structures, we have standards not just tied to each other, but tied to content assets. Now, there's other content assets as well that are about assessment, right? I think last week we mentioned that, or me mentioned that sort of PERT is sometimes used, certainly more than AccuPlacer, to kind of understand people's readiness. But I know in my conversation with Guy, there's also, the FSA assessments. There's also assessments that serve as a sort of stand-in for algebra preparedness or things like the PSCT, the SAT. Guy, what was that term you used? Concordance?
Concordance scores. John, can I pause here for just a second?
Sure, yeah.
All right, so what, just so everyone's clear as to where I'm trying to get the district to go, everything John is showing right now is kind of a mirror, right? We are trying to take what currently exists and map it into this genome, right? Figure out how it all fits together. Next year, we have the opportunity to do instructional materials adoption against the new Florida Best Math Standards, where I am hoping that all the vendors who come to the table will need to tell us how well they fit to the genome so that it actually becomes a framing of what we do, so that we can have questions about efficiency and predictability, and rather than it just being like examining the cadaver of low performance, we're actually using the genome to drive higher performance. That is critically important. So these three strands within the DNA are what we need to come to a better understanding of in the coming months in order to be able to publish some guiding language as part of our instructional materials framework. So keep going. I just needed that stated. So.
Oh, and this just shows the sort of immediate application that this could be put to, and even on like a simple classroom level, right? You take the coherence mapping we talked about in the last slide, right? But if the content is also mapped to standards, then that means a teacher could decide, oh, my student is struggling with, it seems like they're struggling with this algebra standard, but where they're really struggling is they haven't learned property of operations, which is like a 7th grade standard. But here's my content, because the content's tied to the genome also. So that could be brought in for that particular student. So it becomes a way to personalize learning through kind of established data. And there's other content assets. I was going to put Algebra Project in here, for example, because they do map to content standard, but that they also map to my next slide, which are things sort of beyond content, which is where I'm eager, most eager to get some kind of feedback on, because these are all about math, right? The standards are about math. These are about math. Obviously, the genome concept can be applied to ELA and other subjects, but then there's other things that transcend subject matter, right? These are the sort of human factors. First, there's sort of information about individual students. It might be through their IEP status. It might be that they're gifted students, ELL students that might need particular kinds of help or intervention, right? There's also kind of non-cognitive frameworks, right? Like SEL, there's CASEL, but there's also a number of other frameworks, and those can even be mapped to each other. There's learning styles, right? These are things that also provide insight on how students can do in math, but also everything else. You've got sort of mathematical pedagogy, and here's where we get into areas that the Algebra Project is a great example of something that's not just a sort of micro content, but it's got these sort of higher level concepts kind of baked right into the curriculum. But you got mathematical language. Can people have conversations about mathematics? Cultural relevance. mathematical identity, or students sort of forming an identity of themselves as math people, or certainly getting rid of the notion that anybody's not a math person. One of these areas is mathematical practices that, the 8 mathematical practices that are part of Common Core and most associated standards. But the mathematical practices presents, one of the challenges that I'm kind of bringing up here, which is it's pretty straightforward how to map standards to each other. It's pretty straightforward how to map content to standards. But what do we do with some of these areas? As well as, higher order thinking skills like sort of critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, communication. You get a sort of these can be sort of things that are floating out there, like the mathematical practices, or they could be baked right in the curriculum, as with Algebra Project, where we're talking last week about, why do kids think, they're not doing anything creative in math, for example, when in fact math is a fundamentally creative activity. But here we run into like the notion of, what are we actually making connections to? The simplest example might be mathematical practices, right? We could, in theory, map the specific, the 8 mathematical practices to individual content standards. That could be interesting. Like one state, Wyoming, has already done that. But, as Guy and I talked about, there's 8 practices, being mapped onto, 400 or 500 content standards, and often it's 2, 3, 4 at a time. So those may be just too high level to give us an immediate sort of connection of something that could be useful. Critical thinking, anybody who was at this meeting 2 weeks ago when I showed you some of my own critical thinking curriculum material, that's a little bit more fine-grained, right? When someone is studying geometric proofs, right? They're studying deductive reasoning. Okay, so that's a specific thing you're learning when you're learning deductive proofs, or when you're learning geometric proofs. Similar when you're doing a 5th grade standard on categorizing and organizing geometric shapes, that's sort of categorical logic. That's a critical thinking skill that you may not necessarily be doing when you're learning subtraction, although you could be approaching subtraction from conceptual or procedural levels, etc. So I guess I wanted to kind of stop at this slide because this is sort of as, I've just been into this for, a little more than a week. So I wanted to get to this
John,
point.
I want to raise why this is so important, right? So this group, for a large extent, has focused on algebra, which is the culmination of all the arithmetic and proportional reasoning that leads up to it. And we as a school district need to make sure that we are beginning as soon as kids get to us, typically in kindergarten, sometimes in pre-K, that we are able to make sure that by the time they hit algebra, they are ready whenever that hitting algebra occurs. This genome is really rooted in the on-ramp of that kindergarten year, finding out what kids already know, what are we expecting them to know in terms of quantity and relationship, putting things together, and addressing those needs very early on. So in terms of the primary into the intermediate, rather than focusing on algebra as the culmination of it, what are your insights from having dove into this for the last week or so?
They're mostly deriving from, the stuff on those previous 2 slides that, it's you don't want to get to having a bunch of kids who kind of failed algebra in later grades, and your only recourse is, to provide lots and lots of support to kids to make up for lost ground. So I think the notion of this, whether coherence maps or these things that go all the way back, and provide resources at each step, so that not only, you don't just want the algebra teacher to know, this kid doesn't know this algebra standard because they may not know order of operations. You want the 7th grade teacher to know, I better make sure they understand order of operations so they can succeed in algebra, but you can go one step further. What is that, 7th grade? That, you know, connects to a 6th grade standard, to a 5th, to a 4th, to a 3rd, all the way back to kindergarten. That's what the standards are supposed to do. So, you know, it seems like, you know, one terrific outcome for this would be, you know, you don't have any kids struggling with algebra in 10th, 11th, 12th grade anymore because they've all passed it when they were supposed to pass it.
Right.
Unless
So
they-
for the graduating class of 2019, about 15% of those kids entered their senior year needing to demonstrate mastery for algebra because they had not done it. My intent with our current cohort about the class of 2025, who will need to do it, is to cut that significantly. But I want to make the assertion to our graduating class of 2033, who are our kindergarten kids, that they're not going to have to worry about this, that they'll be able to have developed and matured sufficiently in elementary and intermediate grades to be able to master algebra, be it on grade level in grade 9 or even earlier in middle school.
And I think that's where these sort of, like these pedagogies come in, because it's in those early grades where some kids don't develop a mathematical identity, or they develop the wrong one, like I can't do math, or I'm not good at math, you know. So that's why these sort of human factors, I think, are really key. I haven't sort of dove into, you know, what constitutes sort of data that could be built into a genome, but it seems like, you know, we know it works. It works for programs like Algebra Project. Certainly, you know, many successful programs, you know, I looked at the Saga curriculum, and it's very much about sort of, you know, mathematical, you know, perceived processes, thinking patterns. So these have a role to play in there. I think they all do. I think that's why I wanted to kind of throw this slide up now, because I'd love everybody's input as to both, you know, which of these are critical, but also what could potentially be the connection points of, you know, 2 strands of the genome, or what you just saw on those previous slides. You know, what could be, I can automate the Castle standards quite easily, but where do those intersect with, you know, standards and content?
Can I, this is Fitz, Dave Fitzgerald with PCG, and just a question here. To what extent are not just where the student is, or, you know, a characteristic of the student, but what about the context of the student setting, or what teacher has found to be effective in delivering content, or rather instruction to the student? I'm specifically thinking of, you know, there are many accommodations within IEP or strategies of gifted or ELL that, you know, teachers could choose to apply, and some will be effective, I'm sure, for some teachers and perhaps others for others. Where does that come into play with your human factors here?
I mean, these are the very things I want to explore, because it's, you know, I talked a little bit with Guy on this, right? I guess the strategy for gifted students is to advance them to the next course. And maybe that's exactly, you know, the way to do it. But, you know, could there be a strategy where gifted students, or students who do well, accelerate to the next topic, or an alternative topic, or a more in-depth topic within the same course? Similarly, you know, there's IP is a complicated animal. There's sort of sets of accommodations associated with each student that teachers have to kind of track, you know. So that could be as simple as extra time on a test or an assignment, but, you know, in theory, there could be more sort of pedagogical meat baked into the accommodations or the assistance that students on IEPs receive. These are all areas I'm still like the ESL is a great example of I just really need to get up to speed on particular ESL or ELL resources for math.
Well, let me, perhaps I could also provide a little bit of background and, work with you offline as well, but just to the group, one of the things, one of the products that I've been participating with Broward on is what Broward calls SEPA, Student Education Plans and Accommodations. Now, it's really a module that seamlessly works inside of Canvas at the assignment quiz level. And what we just introduced this fall is the ability for teachers to select at an assignment level what accommodations or what specific instructional strategies they are going to apply to which particular students in that course. So there's a lot of data that we're starting to collect. I don't think it's in full force yet, but this year will certainly be one where we'll collect a lot of information around what teachers are at least recording as their practices as it relates to those items.
I think
That's great.
we're
No,
starting.
I'd love to hear about that.
I think we're definitely starting to see the connections here, right? I mean, what Fitz is doing with SEPA with the accommodation grouping, and I think Fitz, you said there were like 650 different accommodations that have been mapped to 7 main categories. That maybe also could be expressed as case data. I'm not sure how shareable that needs to be across systems. And Michael Schweiker, who's on here today, is going to start working with John tomorrow. And I don't think Tara's on, but we want to start mapping in these access points, right? So part of it, for sure, what we want is to get the access points connected into as case data as well. So, Dan, and Marie, is this your vision? Is John doing a good job of capturing it? He's trying to reflect back what he's hearing from you, but he's also trying to synthesize it. We want to make sure that this is actually what you guys want. This is the blueprint of, a year from now, is this the way that you want your math curriculum to be?
Yeah, so yes, and I think one of the steps that I think would be really interesting to take would be to come up with a way to have some students hear what we think and tell us whether or not taking these factors into consideration would have made a difference. But I got to give some thought to how to do that in such a way that it's valid input and not simply anecdotal. Right? Because we think these are things that would have made a difference for kids.
Or recall there's something on a Gates proposal of that very nature, of co-designing with students.
Are there others who want to jump in? I want to make sure that this is as inclusive and participatory as possible. Are there others?
I want to just say a couple of things, Greg, if I can.
Yes.
I think that Jonathan, you definitely have captured the essence of what it takes in order for someone to be successful in an algebra course. The understanding of the prerequisite skills that have to come first in order to be successful as well. What I worry about, what I find equally as important, is how do we package this now so that you change the delivery model in a way in which you're now capitalizing on 21st century technology abilities that can give you feedback very, very quickly, and you can adjust accordingly. That's very, very different from how people are trained to deliver the coursework right now. That is very, very different than how people are packaging the coursework right now, going back to the instructional and digital materials aspect of it. I think that we have to include that as well. Yes, this is all very good. We've broken it down. We understand it. How do we rebuild it now as a delivery model? I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much like that sort of playlist conversation we started and we'll continue. Does this?
Playlist is one way, you know, it's one way, but what it comes down to is going back to what Fitz said about the SEPA app. Teachers need to really know their students. Students really need to know themselves. Back to student agency, Dan. Students need to be able to advocate, to say to a teacher, this is how I learn best. Give me it in that format so that I can be successful. We're really changing a lot of the dynamics of the one-size-fits-all delivery model. And I just think that that is crucial. And, you know, the whole notion of relevance, I spoke to this before, it has to have some kind of meaning in order for it. I mean, somebody can spit it back out at you and still get it right and not have any sort of critical thinking or creativity or know how to communicate what it is that they did. So I just struggle with how to repackage it, how to package it so that it's deliverable.
I'd be interested if Bill's on the line. I'd be curious, you know, you talked last week about sort of creativity and critical thinking. I mean, critical thinking is something that there is a set of like 21st century skills that fall into the bucket of critical thinking that could potentially get mapped, like I talked before. But any thoughts that you have about sort of, you know, how your approach to getting people to think of math as a creative, communicative field sort of might be something that could be sort of connected into this sort of data model?
Who are you asking that of, John?
Oh, I think I saw Bill on here, Bill Crombie. Oh, he might, I saw him earlier. He might not be here, but I think he was the one who brought some up particularly like questions of why don't people think of math as a creative activity.
John, this is Pete. This is Pete Lacase. I just wonder, you know, we haven't talked at all about content design, but it feels to me like that's an important element here. If you're expecting content to really support these types of thinking, you need to be very cognizant of which types of content you're bringing into this framework. And is it, you know, how do you evaluate the quality of that content? It just can't be because a student likes it. That isn't good enough to really get the learning to happen. So how do you balance the, you know, what Daryl was talking about, where like a student's chosen approach so that they engage, but that you're actually ensuring the content is delivering the types of learning experiences that students need to have to progress. I think that's a key element here that really hasn't been discussed too deeply.
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's just because something's mapped to a standard, for example, doesn't mean it's, you know, the right for a particular student. That, in a way, that's why these sort of human factors are important. Is can you have different avenues, for instance, or different playlists based on kind of culturally relevant content? Can you have it based on different learning styles? But one of the reasons I haven't sort of gotten there is I just haven't gotten there yet. But also, you know, I'm thinking that there's also a whole notion of structure. You know, this gets to what Daryl was talking about, is how do you deliver this? And there's likely to be a another set of sort of case elements that are going to sort of capture structure, but I'm hoping a lot of the structure will emerge from the connection of the various connections of the pieces that have been sort of in the 3 slides we saw before. You know, similar to the way DNA is defined in all its like infinite complexity based on how 4 things connect with each other. So I think the notion of content elements, quality of content, relevant of content, but then also how that content is arranged into a course, or maybe not even a course, a playlist or a playlist-based strategy or some other strategy. That's going to come into like conversation of structure that got to get a little bit further down the line before I have like anything really intelligent to say about that.
I would think your playlist strategy has to be very well thought through. There are, really bad mixtapes, and then there
Yep.
are really good mixtapes, right? And so, I like listening to high fidelity soundtrack because it goes so well together, right? But
Mhm.
there are others that are just very poorly constructed. And so I think the question is, do you pull together a playlist that is a program, or do you enable, how loosely can you bring things together, or how tightly do they need to be knit to actually have
Mhm.
impact on the learning experience?
I want to be respectful of time, and I think we're getting, this is the intent of the Broward Equity Co-Lab, right? This is what we're doing. And Peter, thank you for contributing. Travis, looking forward to getting more contributions from you guys. John, I definitely recommend that you reach out to both Peter, Travis, as well as Bill, and do a separate session with them. All of our thinking together can make this good.